Sorry, I think some of my technology is going kaflooey. That's a technical term. Anyway, questions, problems, confusions. How's the first order logic stuff going? Good, Jasmine. Glad to hear it. If Jasmine, if I read your text correctly, I think you sound a little bit tentative, which makes sense because when we're embarking on new territory, or in our case, it's expanding existing territory, right? Sort of conceptual territory. We're in this sort of building phase, and so I think our confidence is tends to be a bit tentative. It's like, okay, I think I'm doing okay, but I'm not quite sure where we're going with all of this, right? That might be a way to if I've read you correctly, might be a way to articulate something like what your experience is. And my response to that is, as with the other ways that we've talked about, as with the previous material, I'll say, yeah, normal, natural. The confidence will intensify as we go forward. If it helps any, I can answer the question where we're going with this. And the good news is you've already been there in one version, right? So where we're headed is in the direction of derivations, right? So we are going to end up with a set of rules for our universal and existential quantifiers. No surprise, symmetry of rules, intro lim, right, for each. So universal intro, universal lim, existential intro, existential lim. And within the context of those rules, we will, and sometimes, I'll just say in the context of those rules, we will continue to do what we already know how to do from our previous derivation work, right? So there's a sense in which what we started last week feels, or I think it was last week, feels like in some sense starting over, and in some sense covering a version of the same territory that we've already covered, right? And that will continue. Jasmine, so your other comment about saying, okay, so I think I think I grasp what we're talking about. The concepts I follow and make sense, and I can think about them. I feel conversant with them, but I haven't yet started practicing. Makes sense, right? I would definitely stay in absorption mode, at least through Thursday, and then start working some practice on your own. As usual, make sure that you let me know if you run out of practice, right? So there is always the additional practice under the course resources module. Okay, so let's do, good one. Get my pen going. Let's do a little bit of a recap. And what I'll do is I'll write the chapters that we were talking about last week, as well as the chapters that we're meant to talk about this week, but that we kind of already started talking about last week. All right, so got our whiteboard. Okay, and as usual, let me know if you have questions, problems, confusions. I've got the chat up. And I also want to hear from you if you are able and willing to speak. So first order logic chapters, or sections from chapters 21 through this week. We're working on 24 and 25. Okay, so I want to make sure that I include some of the versions of the concepts, or sorry, some of the terminological versions of the concepts that we've been talking about, and that I may have either glossed over, or omitted, just to make sure that, when you're going into the text and you read a phrase like long form, short form, you don't wonder what that means, right? Because we hadn't previously talked about it. All right, so one of the approaches that we can take to the work that we're doing is by talking about terms, right? Objects, whether they are named or unnamed, right? And then what we say about them, right? So we've got terms, which we've already seen, are either individual constants, not constants, individual constants and variables, right? So constants are names, while variables are placeholders, if you will, or stand-ins. That is, they are unnamed or unspecified entities. Okay, then we have predicates. And just as a quick PS, now I think we'll see that, I'm explicitly following the order of our text. When we started talking about the material last week, the way that I think it was last week, the way that I presented, I said, look, I'm going to kind of be roaming around some of these early chapters. I'm not going specifically in order. And I had my reasons for doing that, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of, at this point, in our recap, before we move on, strictly follow the order of the chapters, and as much as possible, the sections in the chapters. So we have predicates. We've got properties of objects. And relations between objects. We also, as an example, we can say, we can use a sentence like, I'm not quite sure what happened. I clicked something. I have no idea what happened. I thought I was trying to write, and suddenly I seem to have left the meeting. Sorry. And then, so whatever I just wrote, I think has disappeared, because I wasn't able to save the whiteboard. It should be on automatic save, and I don't think I did that. Sorry, everybody. All right, so let me try to do this over. Sorry about that. Right, so constant is a name, and variable is unnamed entity. So I'm just trying to quickly sketch out what we just talked about. We've got terms and predicates. So we have properties of objects and relations. Relations between objects. And I think that was it, right? So, for example, we can say, here's the sentence, Walter is a dog. Walter is the name, so individual, constant, or name, symbolized. And this is where we get into, short form or long form, symbolized with a lowercase letter or the entire name in lowercase. Right? So short form is just the letter. Long form is the full name. And speaking of Walter, I think he went outside. Hold on, he was supposed to be with me. Hold on just one second. Sorry, I heard him barking, which is why I asked. Sorry, so Walter went off, and he's with one of our new dogs, I think, and they're not supposed to be alone together because they have some issues. Anyway, so I just asked if Walter could be found. Right, so we either use the lowercase, we just grab W, for example, lowercase w for Walter, or we write out the full name in lowercase, and in either case, in parentheses. Thank you so much. Sorry about that, if you were busy. Walter, come here, Wa. Here. Come on here too, Eddie. Yeah, hi everybody. Okay, let's all simmer down. And Eddie, the new dog, is like, I call him the Edmanian devil because he's learning how to settle. Anyway, so then we've got dog is the predicate, right? Dog is what we're saying about Walter. So we can again present this in symbolic logic notation or first order logic notation by way of the short form or the long form. So predicate symbolized with a capital D and then the full name or just D. So we could say D-W, we could say dog Walter. Right? And one of the things that I appreciate about our textbook saying, hey, you can use short form, you can use long form, is I think we get a good sense from this diversity of symbolic logic notational practices that what is not important is the symbol, right? Because it's all artificial, right? This is all language is artificial, the symbolization anyway, right? And so what we want to be able to do is note that we're in this system, whatever convention we adopt or whatever convention we are told to use, that's what we do, right? That's the continuous notational set that we use. So one of the things that's useful about using long form is it helps us to think about what the context is. On the other hand, short form allows us to, especially if we're dealing with rather complicated sentences and let's say complicated arguments, allows us to more clearly see the logical structure. Okay, so we've got these basic elements. And then where did my little note go? The identity. Oops. Identity is also a predicate, but its nature is, I'll say, typically, at least in this context, right, in the context of logic, its nature is numerical, not qualitative, right? So, to say that, and by the way, I hope you remember what I'm about to say reveals, I think, an important way in which our ordinary language fails us, right? But so to say that one thing is identical to another is to say there is one object with two names. So with, for example, two names. Right, so, we were talking about this last week when we talked about saying that, for example, Walter is identical to Wawa, right? Or we can say, I can't do, what's Lady Gaga's real name? Thank you. Is one and the same as, is identical to Stephanie, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So what we're saying is we've got, one object, two names, right? So one way we could visualize it is this, here is the object, and you've got name one, and you've got name two, right? We're not talking about two different things. So even though the identity symbol isn't notated, right, in the same way as other predicates are, we could certainly do that, right? But it's just sort of I think partly because the identity, the quote unquote equal sign is familiar to us already. We understand what equivalence means, so the equal sign is used as the identity symbol, right? But we could do something like this if we wanted to. We could say identical, and then in parentheses it would be Walter, comma, Wawa, right? So this brings us to a couple of ideas that we want to pursue a bit more. One is that in this particular translation, right, you see that we have a two-place predicate, right? You can have many place predicates. We typically don't have more than three predicates, right? So for example, here's a relational predicate left of, right? So A is to the left of B. That's a two-place or two-argument or two-arity predicate. How about between? Between is a three-place predicate, A, B, C. And, we could go on, notice as a reminder, the order of the individual constants is important because of the way we read the sentence back out into ordinary English, right? So we begin with A is to the left of B. So we're going right to left to right again. And then look at the three-place predicate. In ordinary English, we've actually got a conjunction, right? So if I read A is between B and C, you might say, oh, I see a conjunction from the ordinary English. I need to insert my conjunction symbol, right? My ampersand. But in this type of sentence, the conjunction doesn't serve the truth functional purpose that it serves in other sentences. So when we say something like A is between B and C, we don't really have a way to notate the relation involving a conjunction. Or another way is to say what I just said, which is it doesn't serve as a truth functional connective. Right? So here again, we're starting with A. We're saying A is between B and A is between C. I should use different colors, shouldn't I? Right? So A is between B and C. So that order is going to, the order in symbolic logic notation will tell us how to read the sentence. Okay? And like I said just a minute ago or so, the less there is to look at visually, or another way to put it, which can still be consistent with what I've just said, the more exhaustively you can represent the logical structure of the sentence, the easier it is to make sense of how we move through the sequences of a derivation. Okay. Plus, even if we're not thinking about a derivation, but instead we just want to talk about, equivalent sentences, we want to make an immediate inference, we want to understand better what the logical structure is of a particularly complicated sentence, this notation helps us out with that quite a bit. So a couple of other things to say about identity, and then it'll, remember earlier I said, hey, this sentence brings us to a couple of points that we want to talk about, one of which was not exclusive to identity, but a part of understanding identity is the arity or the number of placeholders a predicate has, right? So that's one point. The other point we'll get to, but first, let's talk a little bit more about identity. So we talked about identity being a quantitative predicate, right? So if I talk about, this pen from time 1 to time 2 to time 3 to time 4, right? I'm making an identity claim that the object that I see at time 1 and the object that I see at time 3 are one and the same. They are numerically identical with each other. And notice I'm talking about them as though they're multiples, but what we're really saying is that we're talking about multiple times, right? So, this sort of, slow, careful thinking about what it is that we're saying, at least in logical terms, is quite useful to us in a number of areas. All right, so a bit more about the identity predicate. Okay, so and this is the other point that I wanted to get to, but I'm gonna make an assertion and then I'm gonna move on to a couple of other points, and then we'll come back to this first point. It is not a truth functional connective, right? So the identity predicate doesn't operate on a sentence. So we're going to come back to this, and I'm hopeful when we do and we talk a bit about what we're saying when we say the identity predicate is not truth functional, is we will retroactively kind of make our understanding of truth functionality even more robust than it already is, right? So the more you can deepen and expand, right, the way you're thinking about things, the better. Okay, so it is not truth functional. It has, I'm borrowing from the text here specifically in this terminology, unique properties. But then what I'm about to write is not language that's specifically borrowed from the text. So I'm going to put scare quotes there. It is reflexive. It can be, which is to say something like this: A is identical to A. A is identical to itself. Right? I am me, myself, and I. Right? It is symmetrical. So here's an inference for you. If A is identical to B, then B is identical to A, right? So there's a symmetry of identity. And then finally, and this is what's going to bring us back to talking about truth functionality, it is transitive. And you already know this, even if you're not, a mathophile, right? You already understand what the transitivity of identity means. It's kind of a part of our daily thought. I would think it's part of our daily thought. It's a feature of identity that we use a lot, right? So here's a bit of reasoning. If A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C, right? So the identity of A to B transfers over to C, right? Because B is the animal that transfers that identity. You'd say, well, yeah, Mia, but so does A, because A and B are identical. Yeah, but if we're just thinking about the letters, we can say that. Okay, so thoughts. How are we feeling? Based on what you've already read and what we've already talked about, do you say, yeah, I got this. Makes sense. Does anybody have any questions, comments, problems, confusions? So far, so good? I hope. Okay, so on that note, let's talk about the identity symbol as reflecting, or sorry, rephrase. Let's talk about the notion of transitivity, right? As allowing us to draw logically correct inferences, so valid inferences that are not what we would call tautological consequences or truth functionally valid arguments, right? So think about it this way. If I have the following sentence, I have A is identical to B. Why is this not? Okay, so I have the following sentence. A is identical to B. And then I have the sentence B is identical to A, right? So I put the two sentences in a truth table, right? And I go ahead and lay out the standard order of possible values, right? So two atomic sentences or two simple sentences, 4 rows, right? And so far so good on row 1 or line 1, but now you look at rows 2, 3, and 4, and you say, well, based on the symmetry of identity, you can't have rows 2 and 3, right? In addition, the sort of, if you will, self-evident truth, right? If we're asserting that A is identical to A, we may be wrong that in talking about A in some way, but we can't be wrong about A being identical to itself. So how do we even get a value of false to begin with, right? So we see that, just from the standpoint of truth values, we run into trouble, right? But now let's suppose that we've got, a conjunction, right? A is identical to B and B is identical to A. We'd end up with, on our standard truth table, right? We'd end up with these values, right? And we'd say, but that just can't be, right? So we understand that the sentence is not, that the identity predicate is not truth functional. And if you're a little bit uncertain about that, let's take another example. Let's talk about validity. So suppose that we have the 3 sentences in the transitive relationship. A is identical to B, B is identical to C, so A is identical to C. Let's go ahead and put that into a truth table. Flash quiz, how many rows of the truth table are we going to have?
8.
Yep. Thank you, Victoria. Right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And alternating 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, there aren't any operators, so there's nothing to, to compute, right? There's nothing to calculate. But take a look at row 2, right? The argument fails on row 2. And we'd say, wait, this argument is valid. How is row 2 possible? And the answer is effectively this. I'm gonna say the same thing, but in slightly different terms than I did earlier. It's possible because the truth table is not the correct tool for determining validity, right? For this argument, right? So, it's a first order logically correct argument. It's not a truth table valid argument, right? So it's FOL valid, it's not truth table valid. There's this from another text. There's this really nice. I'll have to pull it up for you because of the way it's. Well, actually, no. I should just reproduce it because the notation's slightly different. But think about it this way. Any argument that is valid from the standpoint of the truth table is going to be valid from the standpoint of first order logic, right? Because first order logic includes connectives, but not the other way around, right? A truth table doesn't know how to cope with the identity symbol, right? A truth table doesn't know how to cope with the quantifier symbols, right? So there's got to be a workaround to determine the truth and falsity of those sorts of sentences. Okay. Thoughts? How are we doing? So if you're comfortable, no questions, problems, confusions, comments, let's do a brief review of our kind of where we left off, I think, last week, right? A brief review of our standard translation of each of our two quantified sentence types. And remember, each type is either affirmative or negative, okay? So remember, we want to translate as follows: the universal affirmative. So by the way, sorry, let me just back up just a smidge. So remember on the first page, we've got our names, which we've been talking about, like Walter and so forth, A, B, C, whatever, right? Lowercase letters. And then we also have our variables, our unnamed entities. And remember, our variables are standardly, X, Y, Z, right? Again, lowercase placeholders, they're in parentheses. So when we are, when we're talking about groups of things, unspecified objects, right? We know we've got objects, but we haven't named the objects. We've got objects that are. So for example, objects that are dogs, dog is the predication, right? So for the universal affirmative, speaking of dogs, now Stuart Stuffy Chunks Thompson is coming over. We'll see if he comes to visit. Do you want to say hi to everybody? You didn't come say hi before. I know. We've got to get our end of semester. Oh, now I'm like pushing my poor dog around. Say hi, Stuart. It's kind of hard to see him. Anyway, he says hi. We got to get our end of semester weekend workshops where we got puppies running around. All right, so universal affirmative, right? Upside down A. Remember that in our textbook, the presentation is with just right side up, capital A. For everything that is an S, it's a P. And I remember I'm using S and P as, grammatical subject, grammatical predicate. So standard universal affirmative involves the arrow. Universal negative also involves the arrow, but there's the negation on the right side of the arrow. Then existential affirmative are backwards E, but again, remember our textbook, uses, for the sake of the ease of a keypad, uses the forward E. And the standard translation uses the ampersand. And then the existential negative. And it's not a bad idea for us to go over and over and over these basic forms because they are our touchstones when things get more complicated. As a reminder, right, your negative quantified claims, when you have the standard, right, the multiple predicates, have the placement of the negation on the right side of the connective. So on the right side of arrow or on the right side of the conjunction, the ampersand, right? The standard universal translation, arrow, standard existential, conjunction, right? Recall our ordinary English words and phrases for the universal and for the existential. So universal is, all are, everything is, for everything that, for every. And then the existential is some are, right? There is at least one, okay? And we'll get into some more specificity. If I'm not mistaken, that should be next week. But we'll be able to kind of drill down in our notation to express sentences that are a bit more specific, but still unspecific with respect to names, right? So you could say there is exactly one dog in the room. I'm not naming which dog is in the room, but if I'm saying there is exactly one, right? If I just use an existential quantifier, we say there is at least one, but there could be more, right? So we want a way to articulate with our logical notation that there is exactly one, for example. Okay, so all this should ring bells. We can also work our universal affirmative, negative, existential affirmative, negative, with using just a single predicate, okay? And this allows us then to start reviewing some of our equivalences, which we started talking about but didn't get into in any real depth. All right, so single predicate quantification. Standard translation. Oops. And I'll just give us the phrasing. So everything is P, whatever the predicate is. Right? Nothing is P. For what it's worth, in ordinary English, there can be a bit of ambiguity in the phrase everything is not, right? So depending on how you accent, what tone you use, you might mean, when you say everything is not, you might mean, some are, right? But in logic, when we say everything is not or all are not, we mean not even one thing is, nothing is, okay? So, suppose, you and I are having a conversation and, I don't know, I start griping about my colleagues or something like that, right? I'm like, man, they do this and they do that. And your response is something like this: oh, Mia, all of them aren't. By which you mean there are some that are, that's the way you're phrasing, the way you're intonating, right? All of them aren't. You're intimating, your intonation says you want to say at least some are okay, right? But in logic, everything is not is a universal negative, so nothing is P. Then we have something is P. And then finally, something is not P. And can you see again that even though we don't have connectives, and by the way, I'm thinking specifically of the negated sentences, even though we don't have connectives, the negation is still sort of interior to the quantifier, if that makes sense, right? It's to the right of the quantifier. Okay, so one of the things that we want to do is ask which sentences are equivalent. Let's also talk a little bit about the contradictories. So we want to know about contradictories. Why? We love our contradictions, right? Generate a contradiction, right? We can then say what we want after, or generate a contradiction. Then boom, we exit our subproof for negation intro, right? But let's start with the following. The two universals are not equivalent to each other, right? To say everything is P is not equivalent to saying that nothing is P, right? How would you, so I'm going to ask you to think about this, and if you can, type in your response or speak your response. Use your understanding of the existential quantifier and the negations to write a sentence that's equivalent to everything is P. Right, so how do you get to from the universal quantifier to the existential? That's my question. In broad strokes, more specifically, my question is, how do you get from the universal affirmative to the logically equivalent expression using the existential? Right? What do you think? And pay attention to the words as you reformulate the sentence that you have in mind, right? So if I say everything's great, what do I need to do to get the existential claim, the existential version of that sentence?
Maybe it's not the case that nothing is P.
Oh, so yeah, very good, Victoria, really close. So if everything is P, it's not the case that something is not P. If I heard you correctly, Victoria, I think you used the universal. By the way, you could, so I think what you did is this. So I know I'm being persnickety so we were looking for the existential, right? I said, what's the logically equivalent sentence using the existential? But you are right? If you did, so if you were to, or I think sorry, forgive me, what did you say again? I just realized that.
It's not the case that nothing is P.
Oh, okay. So you wanted to do this, I think, right?
Yes.
Okay. So here's the question. Can we pull these two negations off? I think that's what you might have had in mind. And the answer is no, because they're not two negations stacked up right next to each other. It would be like, so think about, so if we want to push this negation through either to the interior or push the interior negation out, we have to change the quantifier. Does that make sense? So think about it this way. If I say it's not the case that nothing is, what I'm actually saying is this: there is at least something, which is a more limited claim.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, good, good. But I'm so glad you worked through that. That was good. All right, so let me just erase this guy. All right. How about this one? Let's get the negation. And let's move to the, and by the way, remember the two-way arrow here, the sort of double thickness that I'm giving it, this is meant to tell us that these two sentences say the same thing. So if you go, you can go in either direction, right? You can get from one to the next. So let's do the same thing. Nothing is P. Let's get to the existential. What is the equivalent to nothing is P or everything is not P? What do you think?
Something is P.
I'm sorry, say one more time.
Something is P.
Okay, so something. Now, let me read these back to you. So everything is not P. Something is P. What you've actually got is a contradiction there. Right? So think about it this way. No pianos are stringed instruments. Some pianos are stringed instruments. In other words, so how about I have these two categories? Here are the pianos, here are the stringed instruments, and I'm keeping them separated from each other, right? So all these things are pianos, and all these things are stringed instruments, and not even one is next to the other, or sorry, not even one is in the other camp. Does that make in the other category, right? They're mutually exclusive of each other. But this, some pianos are stringed instruments, tells us the following. Here's at least one P and it's in the stringed instruments category. So these are actually contradictories, which we do want to talk about. What do we think? Does this make some sense? If it doesn't, let's use an example that works for you, right? So I'd want, what's your bag, your deal, your thing? What do you know a lot about, right? So for example, if you know a lot about, sports, I don't know, maybe you're a baseball enthusiast and you might say, no Dodger players are Padres players. That means that you don't even have one Dodger player that's a Padre player and vice versa. But then what you're saying here is there is one. Right? So these are...
So it should be, it's not the case that something is P.
Wonderful. Good. And by the way, if you said that originally, Victoria, and I missed it, I apologize. Jasmine, yes. And Jasmine's given us the notation. Okay. If you said it and I missed it, Victoria, yell at me.
I can't be sure because I think about this, but I'm not sure that I told this.
Okay.
Because it's like it's pretty the same situation like previous one.
Mm-hmm. So yeah. Thank you. Exactly. And everybody sees what Jasmine wrote in the chat. Exactly. Right. Okay. So we go in both directions. Let's go ahead and make some more sentences. How about this one? It's not the case that everything is P. Right? So this says not everything is P. What do you think? And go back to you've been doing this, but as a reminder, go back to your thinking about De Morgan's. You know how you're pushing negations around, and as you push a negation through a conjunction, right? The conjunction becomes a disjunction, and right, and push them out, the connective changes, right? Similarly here, right, we can push the negation through. So not everything is P means something is not P. What do you think? Oh, and Jasmine, sorry, Jasmine already had it. I missed the chat. I'm sorry. All right, what else? We're missing some, aren't we? Let's go through them. So we've got the universal affirmative, the universal negative. We've got a negated universal. What else do we need? Victoria gave this one to us earlier. It's not the case that nothing is, or it's not the case that everything is not. You okay down there?
Yeah. Eddie just ran into something.
Oh, that was Eddie?
Yes.
I don't know if you guys heard that crash. It was the new dog, I think, took a header into the recycling bin. It's not the case that everything is not. Or it's not the case that nothing is. What do you think? And look diagonally up to your right. Do you see the commensurate sentence with the two negations, one on each side of the existential? How are we going to notate this? Beautiful. Yep, exactly. Really good, Jasmine. So, something is P. All right, what do you think? Have we covered all the places where a negation can go legitimately, right? So we've got, if you look at the very upper left corner and the very bottom right corner, we've got our commensurate, right, affirmed sentences. And then each of the rest of them, right, give us the equivalences, but also the commensurate sentences vis-a-vis the negations, right? So now look at the very bottom left corner and the top right corner. Look at so for example, the negation in front of the existential, got a negation in front of the universal, right? So read through those and see if there's any one of those that kind of feels uncomfortable to you. But these are nice to have in your pocket, as it were. All right, I'm going to, are you good with me moving on to a new whiteboard just to get a couple of more ideas out that we said we wanted to talk about today? I'm going to take silence as approval. Okay. Contradictories. Okay, so the universal affirmative and existential negative are contradictories. So if we're saying everything is P, then it's impossible for there to be even one thing outside P, right? So here's one way we could visually diagram the thing. So if everything is P, right? So this is a whole filled with P, right? And then something is not P says, I'm just going to write a little dot here, right? Here's something that's outside of P, right? So if everything is P is true, this can't be the case. It can't be that there's even one thing outside of P, right? So if everything is P, then there can't be anything outside it. Or there can't be even one non-P. Right? We also have, and sorry, let me finish the thought, and vice versa, right? So if it's true that something is not P, it must be false that everything is P, right? So you might formulate it in using that language, right? So if it's true that everything is P, it must be false that something's not P. If it's true that everything's not P, it must be false that, did I just say everything is not P? I meant to say, I don't even know what I started to say. Conversely, if it's true that something is not P, then it can't be true. It must be false that everything is P. Okay. Our other set of equivalences, we've got universal negative and existential affirmative. Okay. Right? So nothing is P. I don't know if there's a formal way we could diagram, but rather than sort of go through that process that, is it doesn't resonate with everybody. I'm hoping that my little shorthand will. Tell me if it doesn't. So everything is not P means, everything's out here, right? And something is P means, yep, we've got something in the P class. So if the universal negative is true, the existential affirmative has to be false. If the existential affirmative is true, the universal negative has to be false. So having these contradictories in your pocket is really helpful as we move forward. Okay, how are we doing? What do we think? Questions, problems, confusions. So while you're thinking about that, let me do this. So, sorry, one other bit of but we can remind ourselves of this during practice. One of the other bit of reviews that or pieces of the sort of quantifier thinking is that we don't leave variables unbound, right? So let's do this. Let's try some practice. Okay. Just to see how we're doing, what our confidence level is. Okay. So let's do this. If you want to type in your answer for each, we can go over them. Okay, so. Oops. Okay. So, no dogs are horses. No dogs and cats are horses. Every flower is blooming. Every flower in the vase is blooming. There aren't any flowers. So, we already know from our equivalences that you can translate a sentence that whose ordinary English suggests or explicitly asserts a universal with the existential. We know we can do that. But by and large, let's unless it's for some reason really hard for us to do that, let's think about translating according to, as literally as possible, according to the quantifiers used. So what are we going to do with number 1? And we can say dx is dog things, or things that are dogs. Oops. Right? H, things that are horses. And you get the idea, right? So there aren't letters that conflict with other letters in the sentence. Okay? All right, so what do you have? Let's work number 1. Is it a universal? Is it an existential? Is it affirmative or negative? So we've got dogs, horses, dogs, cats, horses, flower blooming, flower vase blooming, flowers. Universal, negative, right? Universal negative, universal affirmative, universal affirmative. And here you could use the negated existential, or you could use the universal negative. Let's do it. You ready? go ahead and start, if you're ready, go ahead and start typing in the chat. No tries? All right, I'll start us off. For every x, we'll do short form. If x is a dog, then it's not the case that x is a horse. Again, for every x, if x is a dog or a cat, do you remember we talked about this last week and why we use the disjunction? Then x is not a horse. And we need another pair of parentheses to bind, let me clean this up a little bit, to bind the universal to the variables, right? In 3 and 4, the difference is this. In 3, the context is assumed, right? Every flower is blooming couldn't mean empirically, right? That every flower in the universe is blooming. So ordinarily, we'd want something more, we'd want the domain carved out more clearly, which is what 4 gives to us. That said, suppose that, you and I walk outside and we look in your yard and I say, oh, look, every flower is in bloom, right? We know the context is, your yard, right? My vote is always to specify in logic when we're translating, right? Because, the context, once you're into the translation, it's lost. So if you don't preserve that, then you're in the notation, and now, somebody walking in and looking at the notation isn't going to know. All right. So for every x, if x is a flower, then x is in bloom. Now we get more specificity in terms of the domain of our discourse. If it's a flower and it's in the vase, then it's in bloom. And again, we need our, sorry, this is too far over. We need our binding parentheses. And then, you decide, you could do the negated existential, just as you could do the universal negative. Here again, the context is assumed, right? To say there aren't any flowers, is the domain of discourse the entire universe? No, that's not how we speak, but I'd still want to know. I'd want more of a carving out, if you will. Thoughts. Okay, so rather than in just a few minutes moving on to our next, we want to work on some more equivalences, and we want to talk about first order consequence, right, or validity for first order arguments. We'll jump into that on encounter examples, I think, or no. No, we're only going through 25. Yeah. So we'll actually be a little ahead of schedule by Thursday because I think we'll go into chapter 26 most likely. And then we'll just work, practice. So if you have questions, problems, confusions, comments, let me know. I'm around. I'm here to help. Otherwise, thanks, and I'll see you on Thursday, everybody. Have a good one.